There are stories so old, no one remembers who first whispered them beneath the stars. There are gods who ruled the skies, the seas, and the hidden places beyond mortal sight. Yet their names still echo through time. And there are myths that reveal a curious truth the deeper we wander into them, the more beautifully mysterious the human imagination becomes. Welcome to Relax Story, a place where we slow down, where ancient voices still linger in the shadows, and where legends, forgotten worlds, and timeless mysteries quietly come alive once more. Now then, get comfortable. Our journey into myth is about to begin. That night began with the familiar stillness of a cycle older than human memory itself. Ra stepped aboard the solar bark and entered Duat, not as a god preparing for battle, but as the living heart of a sacred turning that had repeated since the first moment light was given a name. Beneath the world, Duat stretched outward like an ancient ocean of darkness, a realm where night did not stand against day, but existed beside it, preserving the balance of the cosmos. The radiance of Ra cast its glow across silent black waters. Around the vessel, Mehen coiled himself in vast protective rings. At once, a living creature breathing within the dark and an impregnable fortress against all that threatened the journey. Sia stood motionless within the pale golden light, his gaze fixed upon invisible distances that only perception itself could reach. Heka sustained the sacred protection surrounding the voyage, an unseen veil holding order apart from chaos. Far beyond the reach of light, the presence of Apophis remained as it did every night. It did not rush forward. It did not roar. It simply existed, like a wound in the universe that had never truly healed, patiently waiting for the moment when light became careless. For chaos does not need immediate victory. Chaos only needs to endure. It was within that stillness that a subtle disruption first appeared. The dark waters beneath the bark began moving against their accustomed course. Souls that normally drifted in quiet certainty toward the future dawn, awaiting them, suddenly wavered, as though they had forgotten the direction of their own deaths. Farther ahead, the guiding pillars of fire tilted from their eternal positions, their flames trembling beneath the influence of a wind that did not belong to Duat. Mehen sensed the disturbance first, amid the scent of ancient dust that filled the underworld. Another presence emerged, a foreign taste, the salt of a deep sea, the scent of limestone worn smooth by countless centuries of waves, the breath of seaweed drifting beneath moonlight. A distant body of water was entering a realm that had never known an ocean. Ahead of the solar bark, the darkness slowly parted. There was no explosion, no violent collapse. The opening emerged gradually, like the eyelid of some immense being awakening beneath the foundations of creation. Through that fracture, Duat saw something it had never known: a sea. Dark waves moving beneath an unfamiliar sky, the Aegean. That moment was more than the collision of two places. It felt like the meeting of two different understandings of light itself. One world believed the sun must descend through the land of the dead in order to be reborn. The other saw the sun as an eternal journey across the heavens of the gods. Meanwhile, to the east of Greece, the Aegean Sea rested beneath the final darkness before dawn. Its waters carried the deep violet hue of the wine-dark sea, mysterious and unfathomable, like ancient songs still lingering within the wind. Poseidon stood within his ocean. He felt no insult, no challenge. What he felt was change. The sea began to cloud, taking on the color of fertile silt, known only to the great rivers of the south. The Nereids appeared among the reefs and rocky shallows, gazing into the water with growing unease. Long before the highest gods understood what was happening, the daughters of the sea sensed that the ocean no longer belonged entirely to itself. Beneath the surface, strange forms appeared and vanished. An eye, a bird, a solar disk. Memories not born of Greece drifted silently through the dominion of Poseidon. He understood something few gods ever considered. The sea was not merely water. The sea was primordial memory, older than the division of heaven, earth, and the realm of the dead. Sometimes a different color within the water was enough to make every boundary seem fragile. High above, Apollo paused before the eastern horizon. The light had not yet appeared, yet the path of light had already changed. The horizon glowed with a deep crimson hue, like the eyes of some distant desert. Sacred birds lost their bearings in the sky. Familiar signs of navigation trembled with uncertainty, as though the heavens themselves had begun to hesitate. Apollo looked down toward the sea. Two suns appeared upon the waves. One reflection belonged to the familiar order of the Greek world. The other carried the ancient golden radiance of Ra. Between them, a dark fissure widened slowly. For the first time, light no longer spoke with a single voice. It had become the declaration of two different centers beneath the same sky. Even before the reflections faded from the water, far away in Heliopolis, where sacred cycles were preserved through writing, numbers, and the memory of the stars. Thoth suddenly halted his pen in the middle of an unfinished record. Before him lay astronomical charts, arranged exactly as they always had been. The symbols remained in their proper places. The calculations still followed patterns verified through countless revolutions of the sun. Yet something had changed. A gap had appeared within the mathematics. A subtle deviation had entered what should have been perfect cycles. At first glance, it was almost nothing. Yet to the god who measured time and recorded order, even the smallest error carried the weight of profound upheaval. Thoth studied his map of Duat. Along the eastern boundary of the underworld, a region had appeared that belonged to no recorded layer of existence. It bore no symbol of desert, no mark of sacred waters. It belonged to none of the pathways through which the sun traveled before dawn. It was simply a place that should not exist. He lifted his gaze toward the heavens beneath the body of Nut. The stars trembled ever so slightly. The movement was so delicate that most gods would never have noticed. Yet to the keeper of knowledge, the sky seemed like a vast curtain that had been pulled out of alignment. Thoth recorded the anomaly in ancient symbols. None were adequate. No language was precise enough. As his pen hovered above the page, a distant sound echoed from somewhere deep within the world. Thunder, very distant, very faint, yet utterly foreign to Duat. It carried neither the rhythm of the desert, nor the resonance of the sun, nor the breath of sacred waters. Within that echo existed another power, a power of the sky, a power of lightning. Thoth remained silent. He understood that what was unfolding no longer belonged to a single world. The boundaries that once allowed entire systems of order to recognize themselves were beginning to touch one another in places deeper than any map could reach. The greatest unease did not lie within darkness itself. It lay in the possibility that the ancient languages once used to name the universe were no longer sufficient to describe what was coming into being. Meanwhile, where the fracture continued widening beneath the sea, the darkness kept moving. The boundary between Duat and the Aegean grew thinner with every passing moment. From that abyssal opening, long and cold, forms began to emerge. They were not Apophis, not the full manifestation of chaos. They were merely fragments of shadow, nourished by the darkness that had existed around Apophis since the earliest ages. Their bodies resembled streams of condensed night, shaped into serpents. Across their dim black skin lingered markings like ancient funerary symbols worn away by time. Pale white eyes without pupils stared through the sea as though searching for something beyond the awareness of ordinary creatures. They did not hunt, they did not dare, they did not roar. Wherever they passed, the world simply grew colder. Seaweed lost its green vitality. Reefs became covered by an invisible frost. The waters carried the stillness of a graveyard that had never belonged to Greece. The Nereids retreated from the familiar rocks. Their fear did not come from the creatures themselves. It came from the feeling that the ocean was remembering a foreign memory. The shadow creatures seemed drawn toward every place where order became fragile. They sought fractures. They sought stagnant waters. They sought places where light had been bent away from its proper path. On the opposite side of the breach, souls drifting through Duat suddenly heard sounds that had never existed within the underworld. The cry of seabirds, the rush of wings passing above the sea, the distant crash of waves against stone. The sounds echoed through the darkness of Duat, like a reminder that the disturbance was not flowing in only one direction. Two worlds were seeing one another. Two memories were touching one another. As the night slowly approached dawn, 4 signs appeared simultaneously across different corners of the cosmos. Duat reflected the Aegean Sea within its darkness. The waters of Greece carried the silt and ancient symbols of the south. Apollo witnessed 2 suns upon a single sea. Thoth heard thunder from a sky that did not belong to Ra. No declaration of war was spoken. No accusation was made. Yet something else was taking shape. The sea had met the realm of the dead. One sun had encountered another. Thunder had descended into a domain once reserved for darkness alone. The waters of the Nile had appeared within the Greek Sea. Symbolic realms separated for thousands of years were beginning to overlap. A quiet cloud of suspicion drifted across both Olympus and Duat. Poseidon prepared to bring the strange signs of the sea before the gods upon the sacred mountain. Apollo carried the image of the twin suns within his thoughts. Thoth gathered his flawed records to present before Ra. The first thing to tremble was neither the sky nor the sea. It was the belief that every throne still stood at the center of its own world. From that faint disturbance with uncertainty, Olympus began calling its gods back beneath the shadow of the sacred mountain, while in Heliopolis, the guardians of Maat were summoned beneath an ancient golden light that had become more solemn than ever before. Dawn still arrived after the night when the fracture opened between the Mediterranean and the Nile. Yet the light came late, by an interval too small to be measured by any human clock, perceptible only through a hesitation in the breathing of the world itself. Across the plains of Thessaly, shepherds gazed toward the horizon longer than usual, waiting for the familiar gold of morning to spill across the hillsides. In Memphis, priests entered their dawn rituals, carrying an unease they could not quite name. To mortals, it was merely an unusual morning. To the gods, it was the first tremor announcing that a cycle maintained since the dawn of creation had drifted from its accustomed path. What made the disturbance frightening was not its size. Order rarely collapses with an explosion. More often, it begins with a deviation so small it appears insignificant. When dawn no longer arrived at the moment that belonged to it, a crack appeared within the belief that the universe always knew how to sustain itself. Upon Olympus, where the sky was the sacred dominion of Zeus, the clouds circling the mountain moved according to patterns that belonged to no familiar law. The great eagle of the king of gods flew lower than usual, as though the air itself had lost part of its invisible strength. Around the foot of the throne, pillars of lightning emitted a low and distant vibration, insufficient to summon a storm, yet enough to burden the atmosphere within the divine hall. Zeus watched in silence. He had faced the ancient Titans. He had looked directly into the fury of Typhon. Those enemies possessed form, intention, and a clear target toward which lightning could be cast. This was different. What touched Olympus bore no face of an invader. It felt instead like a distant solar power, quietly passing beyond the boundaries of the Greek sky. The silence broke when Hermes appeared before the assembly. The salt of the Aegean still lingered upon his winged sandals. From what Poseidon had sensed beneath the deep waters, and what Apollo had witnessed at the edge of dawn, Hermes assembled a troubling picture. The sea had taken on the color of southern river silt. Strange ancient symbols glowed beneath the waves. During the fragile moments before sunrise, two paths of light had overlapped like journeys that did not belong within the same world. The report cast the whole into silence. The signs from sea, sky, and horizon were no longer isolated events. Together they formed a single warning. Two systems of order were beginning to collide. Hera was the first to speak. In the eyes of the Queen of Olympus, every sacred boundary demanded protection. A sky touched by another power without response would weaken the authority of the throne itself. Athena neither agreed nor disagreed. Her attention turned southward toward the Mediterranean that linked two ancient civilizations. The intuition of wisdom suggested that this did not resemble an ordinary invasion. Ares entered with the cold sound of armor, like the awakening of war itself. Apollo carried with him the unstable light of the altered dawn. Artemis brought the lingering presence of night that still dwelled within the deep forests. Hephaestus arrived bearing the scent of heated metal and forged smoke, a reminder that every fractured order would eventually require rebuilding. Aphrodite perceived a subtler danger. When power becomes uncertain, loyalty becomes fragile. From distant shadows, Hades sensed souls drifting along unfamiliar routes, as though even the realm of the dead had heard the echo of the fracture. At last, Zeus rose slowly from his throne. There was no thunder, no declaration of war. Only a single sentence carried across the hall. Someone has touched the sky of Olympus. In that moment, a disturbance within the cosmos became a question of sovereignty. Hera wished to defend the boundary. Ares wished to prepare for confrontation. Athena wished to understand before judging. Hermes became the natural choice for the first path of diplomacy. Zeus remained seated at the center of power. Yet the silence that followed his words revealed that even the god of thunder understood there were mysteries that strength alone could not resolve. Far to the south, Heliopolis awakened beneath a similar unease. The morning light did not descend upon the sacred city with its usual splendor. The solar bark returned from its nightly voyage like a traveler who had crossed a place absent from every sacred map preserved since the beginning of time. Ra stepped among pillars flooded with golden radiance, yet the light surrounding him seemed weaker than usual, not because the sun had lost its power, but because a faint shadow had appeared within the halo itself, a shadow that did not belong to Duat. The priests bowed with reverence. Beneath the familiar ritual, however, unease spread quietly. They had witnessed something servants of the sun rarely saw. The journey through the night had not fully closed. Dawn had returned later than the rhythm maintained through countless generations. The first light of morning carried a foreign echo, as though during its passage through darkness it had brushed against another sky beyond that of Egypt. The implications struck deeper than any political upheaval. If the sun no longer traveled along its accustomed path, then the invisible balance sustaining the world itself might already be tilting. Ra summoned the Ennead before the solar throne. Within the vast halls of Heliopolis, the ancient gods gathered one by one, the foundational principles of the world assembling to hear the fate of their own order. Isis observed with the gaze of one accustomed to truths hidden behind the veil of reality. She sensed layers of meaning concealed beneath the disturbance, meanings beyond what ordinary sight could perceive. Osiris maintained the calm of a god who had passed through death and rebirth. He understood that chaos did not merely destroy bodies or kingdoms. It also destroyed the laws of inheritance through which order survived from one generation to the next. Horus turned his falcon eyes toward the distant horizon. In the mind of the guardian of the throne, any violation of order could eventually become a violation of authority. Nearby stood Set, like a desert storm restrained within divine form. His presence felt both necessary and dangerous, for no one understood the power of chaos more intimately than the god who had once walked beside it. At the center of the council, Thoth unfolded astronomical records and measurements preserved from the sun's journey. The voice of the god of wisdom carried neither fear nor anger, only the weight of truth. The records revealed a slight deviation within the pathways of Duat. Maps of the underworld showed regions that belonged to no known route. These traces bore none of the familiar nature of Apophis, the ancient enemy whose presence always accompanied recognizable chaos. Instead, they carried another quality, an echo of power originating from a distant sky. The atmosphere within the hall grew heavy. When Thoth spoke the name Olympus as a possibility worth considering, silence spread among the stone columns like the shadow of a sandstorm advancing across the horizon. Set regarded it as an insult to the sacred order of Egypt. Horus saw a threat to solar authority and the throne. Only Isis remained calm. She sensed that the two great systems of the world might have touched one another unintentionally, at a point neither side had deliberately created. Ra listened to every voice in silence. The silence endured so long that the entire hall seemed to await the judgment of the sun itself. Finally, he spoke. Another sky is looking upon Egypt. The conclusion was delivered gently, yet it carried the weight of a decree. If Olympus understood the disturbance as an intrusion upon the sky, Heliopolis perceived it as a tilt in Ma'at itself, the principle that upheld justice, truth, and order throughout the world. The two divine councils had not yet seen one another. No Greek god had entered the halls of Heliopolis. No Egyptian god had appeared upon Olympus. No lightning had struck the Nile. No desert sands had swept across Athens. No divine army had been summoned. Yet something more dangerous than war had begun to form. Zeus believed someone had touched his sky. Ra believed a force was tipping the scales of Ma'at. Olympus began thinking in the language of sovereignty. Heliopolis began thinking in the language of cosmic order. Between those two interpretations, an invisible distance continued widening, much like the fracture itself between the Mediterranean and the Nile. Far from the halls of the gods, souls had already begun drifting along unfamiliar paths. Roads that once remained separate between different realms of the dead were becoming fainter with each passing day. Because of this, messengers would soon have to depart. Hermes would travel toward the lands touched by Egypt, deep within the domains where the dead resided. Anubis and Hades would also be drawn into the unfolding crisis. For the fracture was no longer shaking only the sky and the sun. It was beginning to touch the oldest mystery shared by every civilization, the journey of the soul after death. As debates over the rift between the Mediterranean Sea and the Nile spread from Olympus to Heliopolis, unease no longer lingered only in the heavens, where the stars traced their ancient paths, nor upon the waters where the waves carried the memories of gods. A deeper layer of the world had begun to tremble. It was the realm no living person could enter in the flesh, the place through which every journey would one day pass in the form of a soul. In the Greek world, the dead were guided into the domain ruled by Hades, crossing shadowed waters, passing beneath the watch of Cerberus, and moving toward the fate allotted to them. In Egypt, death was not an ending, but a passage of judgment, where the heart was weighed against truth, where Duat unfolded as a long road stretching between order and eternity. As the sun's course drifted from its familiar rhythm, the realms of the dead, separated since the earliest ages, slowly began to lose their secrecy. A new fear emerged. If souls themselves began to lose their way, this crisis would no longer be a dispute among living gods. It would become a question about the very meaning of the afterlife. Zeus understood that no spear could answer such a question. He did not summon Ares, nor did he call upon Apollo. Instead, Hermes was chosen to make the journey. The god of crossroads, boundary stones, and roads that joined one world to another departed Olympus as dusk spread its bronze-red light across the Aegean Sea. His winged sandals carried him over islands, sinking into the evening glow, beyond Cyprus, and toward a land where the green of olive groves gradually surrendered to the endless gold of sand. Memphis appeared beneath the fading light, like a memory older than empires themselves. The air felt heavier there, slower, as though time had been held in place by prayers spoken for thousands of years. Ibises stood motionless beside the marshes, while the shadows of animal-headed statues stretched across the earth at angles no ordinary sunlight could have created. Hermes realized that he was not merely approaching a city. He was stepping into an entirely different order of existence, one in which every ritual carried the weight of the dead. The closer he came to the ancient stone temples, the more unmistakable the feeling became. There were no towering walls defending borders here. The true guardians were rituals, symbols, and the souls entrusted to eternity. Before Memphis, Hermes saw a gate that did not belong to the earth. It stood silently within reality, like a wound cut through the visible world. Beyond it, dark waters flowed beneath reversed starlight. The shape of Duat shimmered faintly, as though the underworld itself were being slowly drawn toward the surface by the very rift that had shaken the heavens. Standing before that gate was Anubis. He did not appear as a warrior preparing for battle. He stood there as though ritual itself had taken physical form. The black of funerary resin covered his jackal head. His golden eyes regarded Hermes with the caution reserved for something that had never before existed within the order of Egypt. Around him lingered the scent of linen, sacred oils, and the traces of ceremonies devoted to protecting the body from the erosion of time. Anubis did not raise a weapon. He asked only one question: "What are your souls weighed against?" The question made every gesture of diplomacy seem suddenly small. Hermes knew memory. He knew fate. He knew the judges of the Greek underworld. He knew the waters of Styx and the oaths that could never be broken. Yet the Greeks had never placed their hearts upon a scale beside the feather of truth. They entered death by another road, guided by another logic, quietly. Anubis explained that souls who had never passed through such a balance could not safely enter Duat. Hermes did not answer at once. His silence was not a defeat. It resembled the moment when one civilization first hears death described in a language entirely foreign to its own. Elsewhere, far beneath the layers of darkness that lay beneath the Greek world, Cerberus suddenly growled. All three heads turned in the same direction. The waters of Styx shivered as though touched by a wind that did not belong there. Souls gathered along the riverbank drew closer together as an unfamiliar scent drifted through the air, the fragrance of funerary resin that had never before existed within Hades. Hades rose from his throne of black stone. Persephone walked beside him through rows of shadowed columns. Upon the surface of Styx, a strange shape appeared and vanished. It was not an intrusion by Anubis. It was the reflection of another vision of the afterlife brushing against the borders of the Greek underworld. Persephone gazed at the water for a long time. She understood what no one wished to speak aloud. The sky could be shared through agreements. The sea could become the object of dispute. Yet when the realms of the dead began to mirror one another, the meaning of life itself began to waver. No one desired war in that moment. Even so, both sides felt that something sacred had been touched. That fear ran deeper than power itself, for it concerned the fate of the souls each civilization had protected for thousands of years. At last, Hermes stepped back from the gate of Duat, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that his words alone were not enough to cross a boundary built from ritual itself. Anubis declared no hostility, yet the gate remained closed. Hades offered no direct challenge, yet his gaze had already turned toward Egypt, as one might look toward a danger of a profoundly metaphysical nature. As Hermes departed with the scent of funerary resin still clinging to his winged sandals, and as Hades stood silently before Styx, reflecting a shadow that did not belong to it, both Olympus and Duat began to understand that this rift would not be healed through accusations. It demanded something slower than war, deeper than diplomacy, a path that power alone could never illuminate. In that place, only wisdom possessed the patience to read the causes still hidden behind the darkness of divine pride. The air upon Olympus still carried the lingering echoes of suspicions that had found no answer. Hermes had been turned away at the gates leading into Duat. Hades had sensed a foreign form of death reflected upon the waters of Styx, like the distorted image in an ancient mirror. Within the great halls where the gods often gathered to discuss the fate of the world, unease spread quietly, like a cloud not yet ready to become a storm. Elsewhere among the divine realms, Ares had already begun to view the growing disturbances through the eyes of war. At the same moment, beyond the desert, Set felt the familiar call of conflict stirring in the distance. Athena, however, saw something different. She understood that very few wars truly begin with hatred. Most begin with something misunderstood, then grow through layers of misinterpretation until no one can remember what the original cause had been. She left Olympus without the grandeur of a goddess preparing for battle. Her long spear remained beside her throne. The Aegis shield was not carried as a symbol of power. Instead, Athena brought star charts, records of the heavens' unusual movements, and ancient memories of Metis. Within her mind, the image of Metis echoed from an older age. That wisdom had once been consumed by power out of fear of losing dominion. Athena herself had been born from that paradox, a living reminder that wisdom may emerge within power, yet power does not always choose to listen. For that reason, she was not searching for an enemy. She was searching for a cause. She knew that when wisdom arrives too late, war begins writing its own reasons. Afternoon settled over the Nile delta in muted shades of bronze. The light did not fade as it did above the northern seas. Instead, it descended layer by layer, like an ancient ritual unfolding across the horizon. Amid the land where countless branches of the river met, Sais appeared in the quiet company of stone, water, and memory. It was more than a city. It felt like a place where ancient ideas had been preserved against the erosion of time itself. The temple walls carried the images of guardian gods. Stone columns were covered in astronomical markings. Papyrus scrolls held the scent of resin, dust, and generations of scribes who had long since vanished into eternity. Above them all, nuts still arched across the ceiling as the endless star-filled sky, as though no night had ever truly ended. Athena walked through long corridors where every distance had been measured with care. Here, wisdom was not placed within debate. It was embedded in stone, in the orientation of temples, in the proportions between earth and stars, in symbols that had outlived the voices of those who first created them. Within the sacred library, Thoth was waiting. He did not stand like a god guarding his domain. He resembled a patient scribe, waiting for the final piece of information needed to complete an unfinished record. Beside him stood Sekhmet, goddess of writing, time, and measurement. Spread across the stone table before them were astronomical instruments, records of sacred cycles, ritual maps, and countless symbols flowing across the surface like rivers of ink. No one spoke. The silence did not arise from suspicion. It arose from respect for knowledge. Those who truly seek truth often understand that listening must come before speaking. Athena unfolded her charts, documenting the strange shifts in the skies above Greece. The positions of the stars no longer aligned perfectly with their familiar cycles. Certain signs observed by Apollo suggested that the path of light itself was being influenced by an unknown force. Thoth spread out the cyclical maps of Duat. Within them appeared a section of Ra's nightly journey that had passed through a region absent from every ancient record. Sekhmet began comparing the information through calculations of time and the sacred alignments of temples. At first, everything seemed disconnected. The language of Olympus was written in divine trajectories and celestial signs. The language of Duat was written in the journey of the sun through darkness. The language of Zeus was written in symbols, stone, and ritual memory. Yet as the layers of knowledge were placed upon one another, a new shape slowly emerged. Every anomaly twisted toward the same point. That point lay somewhere between the Mediterranean Sea and the deepest darkness of Duat. Athena studied the evidence for a long time. There was no sign of an invasion, no advancing force, no command issued by any supreme god. What appeared instead resembled an invisible tunnel being carved beneath two entirely different systems of order. Athena thought of Apophis, but Thoth gently shook his head. If the unbroken chaos of Apophis had truly prevailed, the sun would never have returned. Dawn arrived late, yet it still arrived. That meant the cycle had been touched, not consumed. At that moment, Sekhmet placed an ancient stone tablet upon the table. Carved into its surface was the image of a many-headed creature coiled among fire, storms, and serpents. Athena recognized it immediately. Typhon. The memory of the being that had once shaken all Olympus appeared within her eyes. It was more than a monster. It was the memory of a time when the sky itself had nearly been torn from Zeus. A symbol of chaos that had never truly vanished. Slowly, the truth revealed itself. Apophis and Typhon possessed different forms, different symbolic languages, different civilizations, yet both had been born to oppose order. Both sought to unsettle the light. Neither had ever been completely erased from the world. Within the dim glow of the library, Athena and Thoth finally saw what no separate map could reveal. A fragment of Apophis lingering within Duat had reached the sleeping echo of Typhon beneath Etna. Across the distance between two mythologies, the two forms of chaos had recognized one another. That resonance bent the path of the sun, distorted familiar cycles, and opened the fracture between the Mediterranean and Duat. War was not the cause. War was merely the symptom. The greatest danger was not the strength of chaos itself, but its ability to make systems of order misunderstand one another long enough to become its instruments. Far away, deep beneath Mount Etna, stone trembled with a movement so slight it could scarcely be noticed. Thoth paused his writing. Athena gently closed her eyes. Once more, she thought of Metis, wisdom that had been swallowed by power in order to protect a throne. Truth is not always heard when it first arrives. For that reason, Athena and Thoth did not rush to reveal what they had discovered. Olympus was defending itself. Heliopolis was doing the same. A truth revealed too early might be dismissed as a conspiracy. A truth revealed too late might survive only as an explanation for a catastrophe that had already occurred. Seshat carefully preserved every record. Athena and Thoth became the first to glimpse the deeper nature of the rift. Within the star-filled library of Sais, the truth rested quietly upon the stone table like a small lamp. Yet beyond those walls, where desert sands slowly shifted beneath unseen winds, there were already forces that would not wait for wisdom to complete its calculations. For in every age, violence tends to recognize its opportunities far more quickly than any explanation ever can. West of the Nile, where bands of red sand stretched all the way to the horizon, the boundary between the land nourished by water and the land claimed by drought seemed more fragile than ever before. Hot winds drifted quietly across the dunes, carrying the feeling of a world holding its breath. While the divine councils still debated Ma'at, the disturbed heavens, diplomacy, and the limits of war, Set had long since walked away from those conversations. He moved alone through the desert as though he were a part of the landscape itself. Set was not darkness standing against order. He was the force that had always existed beyond the walls that order built. He was the sandstorm emerging from places no one could control. The cry of the wind across lands that had never bowed to any ruler. That was why fear of him had always existed alongside the need for him. A world of balance without challenge would become as fragile as a still lake untouched by a single ripple. Ahead of Set walked his strange sacred beast. The creature belonged fully to no known species. Beneath the fading red light of evening, its lean form appeared and vanished among the drifting dust like a mirage. It hunted nothing. It searched for no companion. It moved like a sign of the frontier itself, where every gust of wind could erase a trail of footprints within moments. Then the beast stopped before a dark cleft of stone rising among the dunes. Its ears lifted toward the darkness ahead. It had sensed something the desert winds had not yet carried to the other gods. It was not the scent of blood, nor the scent of steel. It was the scent of a war not yet born, yet already alive as an idea. From the shadowed opening stepped a figure. Ares appeared without carrying any mission from Olympus. He had come by instinct alone, as though some hidden part of war itself had guided him to this place. Two other shadows followed silently behind him. One carried the presence of terror given form. The other breathed the panic that shattered ranks before the first sword had even left its sheath. The moment Deimos and Phobos stepped onto the red sands, nearby scorpions hurried deep beneath the earth. The air grew strangely heavy, like the stillness that lingers after a brutal battle even when no clash has yet occurred. Set's beast released a low growl from deep within its throat. Whether it was a warning or an acknowledgement was impossible to tell. Set and Ares stood facing one another in the silent expanse. There was no ritual, no greeting, no gesture of friendship. Something else existed between them, a recognition, a mutual understanding between two powers that knew violence as one of the natural languages of the world. Set spoke first. He asked whether the Greek gods were still arguing. Ares studied him for a moment and asked the same question of the Egyptian gods. Set replied that they still believed everything could be brought back into balance. A faint smile touched Ares's lips. It was not a happy smile. It carried the ancient weariness of one who had witnessed too many wars begin before rulers even realized they had already started. In his mind, councils of gods were always several steps behind war itself. Silence returned between them. Set was the violence of the desert, of sandstorms, of forces that shattered order from beyond its borders. Ares was the violence of the battlefield, of fear, cold steel, and the fury born within societies that already possessed laws and structure. Their origins were different, their symbols were different, yet they met upon a deeper understanding. Both knew that beneath every piece there remained a crack waiting to be named. No promises were exchanged, no alliance was declared. Yet within that silence, an invisible agreement took shape. If war truly arrived, neither would need long to understand the language of the other. Elsewhere, Athena and Thoth still guarded their thoughts concerning the connection between Apophis and Typhon. The truth remained hidden behind many veils. Yet war had never required the whole truth in order to recognize an opportunity. Deimos and Phobos left behind a lingering unease that refused to take a clear shape. Set's beast continued its journey across the dunes, moving like an omen of something steadily growing beneath the surface of the world. Far to the north, deep beneath the dark heart of Etna, Typhon stirred once more. The movement was so slight that no mortal could possibly have felt it. Even so, it resembled the memory of chaos awakening beneath the warmth of the earth. When Set and Ares departed, without the need for any oath, the desert retained the heat of their meeting, the way sand remembers footprints long after the traveler has vanished beyond sight. And along the banks of the Nile, where the fragrance of flowers and the glow of lamps reflected upon the water were beginning to replace the desert's crimson light, another power was also awakening. It carried no steel, it carried no sandstorm. Yet there are times when a single mirror and a single gaze are enough to make ancient thrones tremble. The eastern bank of the Nile rested beneath a gentle night sky. Near Dendera, where ancient columns bearing the sacred face of the celestial cow quietly supported the temple roof against the darkness. A festival was kindled like a small answer to the unease spreading across the world. The atmosphere here was far removed from the dry heat of the desert, far removed from the lingering echoes of the meeting between Set and Ares. Incense smoldered softly along the stone steps, descending toward the water. Oil lamps drifted upon the Nile, moving so slowly that they seemed like stars that had chosen to leave the heavens and sleep upon the river's surface. The long notes of stringed instruments blended with the steady rhythm of drums and the delicate rattle of sistrums, creating a sacred stillness where people tried to remember how to keep living while invisible. Fractures continued to widen beneath the familiar order of the world. Within that celebration, Hathor appeared beneath the rows of stone columns carved in her own holy image. She did not emerge as a beauty meant to enchant, but as the ancient memory of life enduring beyond every loss. In the pale golden glow of the lamps, priestesses dressed in white linen wore golden jewelry and raised their sistrums high, letting them sing with every movement of their hands. Each gesture resembled a prayer that needed no words. Hathor carried within her love, fertility, joy, and the abundance of the earth. She did not deny the existence of death, nor did she attempt to conceal fear. She simply made fear easier to carry, like a song that could accompany a traveler through the longest night. As Hathor moved through the circles of reflected light dancing upon the water, even the rift dividing worlds seemed wrapped in music. It still existed, yet it no longer felt as sharp as before. Life became a small lamp shining within darkness, unable to banish the night entirely, yet bright enough to remind people that dawn remained possible. From the distant sea came a breeze carrying the salt of the Mediterranean into the Nile valley. Aphrodite arrived with the fragrance of myrtle, the scent of the sea, and memories of islands where blue waves endlessly struck white stone shores. She entered the festival without announcing her presence. The meeting between Aphrodite and Hathor carried none of the shape of a confrontation between rival powers. They recognized one another almost immediately, as though two distant rivers had suddenly discovered that they reflected the same moon. Beneath the columns of Dendera, the two goddesses became mirrors of one another. Aphrodite embodied beauty born from the sea, from waves that never ceased their movement. Hathor embodied joy rooted in fertile land, in ritual, and in the music that echoed through temple halls. One was as graceful as the sea at sunset, the other as gentle as the trembling song of a sistrum in the night. Different though they were, both represented the force that inspires life to continue. That joy expanded further when Dionysus arrived with his retinue. Laughter, the fragrance of ripe grapes, and the warmth of wine spread through the air like a welcoming tide. He had not come to disrupt the ceremony, but to release emotions that fear and the threat of war had quietly imprisoned. Greek wine mingled with Egyptian barley beer. Music from two civilizations blended into a rhythm that belonged entirely to neither world. Hathor saw within Dionysus another way for mortals to face uncertainty. Sometimes a cup is raised not to forget life, but to remember that one is still living it. Yet beauty has always made power uneasy upon Olympus. Hera watched the festival from among silver clouds. What unsettled her was not merely the way Zeus looked toward Hathor. Beyond the goddess, Hera saw an entire civilization, another kind of light capable of softening the lines that had long defined Olympus. In troubled ages, love is not always seen as a bridge. Sometimes it is viewed as an opening. On the other side, Isis quietly observed Aphrodite. She understood the power of love more deeply than many gods ever could. Love had once helped bring a god back from darkness. Love had once protected a child from forces determined to destroy him. Because of this, she also understood that such power could become dangerous when guided toward the wrong purpose. As those thoughts quietly spread, Eros crossed the night sky like a small spark of flame. He lifted his arrow and then paused. No arrow was released. Love was already present within the festival. Yet, it had not chosen a specific form. Desire was strong enough to make gods look at one another differently. Yet it remained only a whisper, not yet spoken aloud. The polished bronze mirrors of Egypt reflected the silver mirrors of Greece. For a moment, Aphrodite and Hathor stood before a golden mirror placed among the lamps. They saw the familiar beauty of their own reflections. Yet beyond that beauty lay a growing darkness. Even the brightest festival became the place where the fracture could be seen most clearly. Love does not erase war. It merely gives war a gentler face, a quieter face, one far more difficult to name. Aphrodite and Hathor had recognized the kinship between their two forms of love. Dionysus had created a rare moment in which two civilizations could stand beside one another without causing harm. Hera began to keep her suspicions close to her heart. Isis concealed her vigilance behind calm eyes. Eros had still not acted, yet his hesitation felt like a promise that love would return during the decisive moments still waiting ahead. Love has always been a power that opens doors. Yet when worlds fear intrusion, every door that opens can be mistaken for a wound. As the music of the sistrum and the flute continued drifting across the Nile, like fragile rings of light upon the water, Hera withdrew her gaze into the silver clouds, while Isis remained silent before the golden mirror. For beauty had opened a path between two worlds, and in uncertain times, any path can be seen as the road by which an enemy may arrive. Light had never worn only a single face. There were lights that guided humanity through knowledge, through art, and through prophecies whispered down from the heavens. There were also lights shaped like fire, fever, and judgment cast upon anything that threatened the order of the cosmos. Apollo belonged to the first kind. His light measured, healed, and listened to the rhythm of the world before it chose to act. Sekhmet carried within her the heat of the sun at its most merciless hour. She was the warrior of Ra, the lion-headed goddess crowned with the blazing solar disk, capable of bringing disease, capable of curing it, and capable of becoming the flame that consumed the enemies of order. In those days, she did not leave Duat in search of glory or new lands to conquer. What drew her across the distance between the Nile and Greece were the traces of chaos leaking from the widening fractures spreading through the world. Yet to Olympus, the arrival of a foreign power carrying the heat of distant deserts into Greek soil was not something easily ignored. Early summer laid an ancient gold across Thessaly. The wind drifted over dry grasslands, carrying the scent of oak leaves from forests stretching beneath the slopes of Mount Pelion. This was a land that still remembered the footprints of the centaurs. It had once watched Chiron pass on wisdom, healing arts, and knowledge to the greatest heroes of Greece. Mountains, forests, lakes, and plains existed here in a balance centuries old, where the hunt was not an act of destruction, but part of the greater law of survival. Thessaly felt like a living chronicle. Within its soil lingered the memory of wild beasts, physicians, heroes, and the half-horse wanderers who had once crossed its mountains and woods. Because it carried so many memories, the land sensed change before any other place. Before Sekhmet appeared, shepherds had already begun sharing stories of strange shadows emerging near the foothills of Mount Othrys at dusk. They resembled nothing known to either Greece or Egypt. Their twisted forms stretched unnaturally, as though time itself had melted their bodies. They moved against the direction of light, leaving behind trails that drained the color from the grass. Across their dark skin appeared unfamiliar funerary symbols, intertwined with serpent scales and claws carrying the breath of ancient abysses. Wherever they passed, Hunting dogs refused to approach. Night birds altered their course in mid-flight. The water in the wells turned unnaturally cold, as though being pulled towards some nameless depth beneath the world. The forests fell silent in a way that made it seem as though nature itself was holding its breath. These signs confirmed what Athena and Thoth had feared. The fracture was no longer a solitary crack. It was opening into countless smaller wounds, quietly leaking chaos into the world. Then, at the hour when the sun stood highest above Thessaly, Sekhmet arrived. There was no escort. No ceremony announced her coming. Only a hot wind carrying the scent of resin, sand, and memories from distant deserts. The head of the lioness gleamed like heated bronze. Her hair moved like living streams of fire. The solar disk above her brow radiated a light that made the air tremble. Every step caused the dry grass to curl inward, as though bowing before the heat she carried. A griffin perched upon a cliff opened its eyes and launched into the sky. Deer deep within Artemis's forests fled long before they ever caught sight of the goddess. The entire plain seemed drier, more golden, as though a fragment of the desert had been placed at the heart of Greece. When the chaotic entities emerged from the shadows near Othrys, Sekhmet did not hesitate. Her claws tore through the distorted forms, reducing them to showers of glowing crimson ash. Her roar rolled across the plain, sending ripples across the surface of distant lakes. The light of Ra blazed through Thessaly, burning away the fragments of chaos before they could sink deeper roots into the land. Red ash drifted down upon the golden grass. The lakes reflected flickering sparks that seemed like memories trembling before something older than themselves. Then a silver arrow struck the ground before Sekhmet's next step. Artemis had arrived. She stood at the edge of the forest beside hunting hounds, as white as mountain mist. Wind moved through her pale silver hair. Her gaze rested upon the smoldering patches of ash scattered across the earth. Artemis did not deny the danger of chaos. She had seen the spreading signs herself. What she could not accept was the sight of a foreign flame deciding the fate of a sacred forest through the force of its own heat. To Artemis, the hunt was a ritual of balance. To Sekhmet, chaos was a plague that had to be burned away before it was given the chance to spread. Two forms of power stood facing one another. One pursued darkness with fire. The other protected life through distance, boundaries, and silence. Not long afterward, a third light appeared. Apollo stepped onto the plain after sensing a change in the rhythm of Thessaly's light. He saw the red ash still glowing upon the earth. He felt the presence of another sun standing upon Greek soil. His gaze settled upon Sekhmet's solar disk. "This is not your desert." His voice remained calm, yet the air tightened around the words like a drawn bowstring. Sekhmet answered without taking a single step back. Chaos does not ask permission before it spreads. In that moment, none of them were defending personal ambition. Apollo defended the light that belonged to Greece. Artemis defended the sacred forests and the ecological balance of Thessaly. Sekhmet defended the journey of Ra's son against the encroachment of chaos. Because none of them were entirely wrong, the confrontation became all the more dangerous. Evening descended slowly across the plain. Thin streams of smoke began rising from the scorched traces left among the grass. Artemis's forests remained wrapped in an unnatural silence. Apollo stood upon a land where light itself seemed to be pulling in different directions. Sekhmet remained fixed upon her purpose of hunting chaos. Yet in the eyes of many Greek gods, she had already become one who had crossed a forbidden boundary. Far away, the image of the Nemean lion stirred within the memory of Heracles, like an ancient reminder that this land, too, had once given birth to powers that bowed before no force except their own sun. The red ash remained scattered across the golden fields of Thessaly. Apollo's gaze never fully left the solar disk above Sekhmet's head, and the world learned something both slow and painful. Light does not always live in harmony with light. When many suns believe they alone are guiding the path of order, the earth may begin to burn long before darkness ever arrives. And somewhere beyond the horizon, where waters were flowing toward the Nile, another conflict was beginning to stir, waiting for the day when sea and river would ask a deeper question about the boundaries that truly nourish life. Light had scorched the plains of Thessaly beneath the footsteps of Sekhmet, Apollo, and Artemis. Yet as those fierce rays slowly faded, an older power began to stir. The conflict no longer lingered among the heavens or within the radiance of divine crowns. It descended into the waters that had nourished civilizations since the age when humanity still looked upon the world with its deepest and most instinctive reverence. Greece had grown alongside the sea, alongside voyages threading through rocky islands and storms roaring across the Mediterranean. Egypt had been nurtured by the Nile, by black silt, by the returning flood, and by green fields rising from golden desert sands. One civilization gazed toward endless horizons, the other rooted itself in a river that returned each year like a promise. Between those worlds, water carried two different memories. The sea wished to expand. The river wished to sustain. Both were powers older than any throne carved from stone. Off the coast, where the Mediterranean touched the Nile Delta, Poseidon stood amid dark blue waters whose currents had begun to behave strangely. Since the fracture appeared, the great flows of the sea no longer followed their familiar rhythm. Fish from the deepest waters avoided the river mouth as though fleeing something unseen. The black sediment of the Nile lingered within the salt water, refusing to dissolve completely. What troubled the god of the sea was not the change itself. It was the feeling that the Nile carried its own dignity. All rivers eventually found their way to the ocean, yet the Nile bore none of the appearance of surrender. It seemed like a self-contained order, a living current of memory shaped by floods, black earth, and the souls of millions who depended upon its waters. Poseidon raised his trident. From the north, dark clouds gathered over the sea. Waves rose into a towering wall of water that swallowed the horizon. Triton appeared astride a colossal sea creature and lifted his conch shell to his lips. Its call rolled across the waters, and the ocean trembled as though it had rediscovered its own voice. Among the silver-crowned waves, Nereus emerged in silence. He did not encourage the sea's anger. He merely watched through the ancient eyes of a god who had witnessed countless civilizations rise and vanish beside the water. Salt water surged into the mouth of the river. Papyrus boats turned sideways against the current. Harbors shuddered beneath the pressure of the swelling tide. The sea began to push deeper into lands long accustomed to the sweetness of fertile water. Yet the Nile did not answer with immediate fury. Its surface moved slowly, heavily, profoundly. Ancient crocodiles rose together from the river and turned toward a single point. From the murky depths, Sobek emerged. Dark green scales covered his body like stones that had slept for thousands of years beneath the riverbed. Lightning flashed across the sharp edges of his crocodilian teeth. Around him, sacred crocodiles crawled through the mud like living memories of the Nile itself. If Poseidon was the call of the open ocean, Sobek was the embodiment of floodwaters, fertile earth, survival, and the silent strength of the ambush. He carried none of the violence of a storm. He carried the weight of cycles that had sustained an entire civilization across countless generations. Behind Sobek, within reed-covered marshes, Taweret emerged half-submerged beneath the water. Her form, woven from hippopotamus, crocodile, and lion, possessed a majesty that was both gentle and fearsome. She did not enter the confrontation. Her presence served only as a reminder that the Nile was not defined solely by predatory jaws. The river also protected children, harvests, families, and fragile lives that depended upon its care. Ibises rose together from the wetlands. Hippopotamuses shifted through the shallows. Crocodiles remained motionless beneath the dark mud. The sacred ecosystem of the Nile seemed to be listening. Poseidon looked at Sobek. "You believe a river can stop the sea?" Sobek answered in a voice as deep as underground currents. "You believe the sea knows how to nurture life?" The silence between those questions carried the weight of two civilizations. One had learned to cross oceans in search of new horizons. The other had learned to wait for the flood's return in order to survive. The trident descended. The sea rushed into the Nile like the jaws of a colossal predator. Sobek summoned fresh water from the deepest branches of the river. Black silt surged upward from the riverbed, weighing down every invading layer of salt water. Sacred crocodiles cut through the murky waves. Massive hippopotamuses shattered columns of water advancing toward the floodplains. At the meeting place of sea and river, a dark whirlpool slowly formed, like the visible mark of two ancient wills testing one another. There was no absolute victory. Poseidon realized that the Nile was not a fragile current waiting to be consumed. Sobek realized that the ocean was not merely the destination of every river. It was a power that forever sought to move beyond every boundary ever drawn against it. At last, Poseidon lowered his trident, not in submission, but because he had felt the weight of the silt and memory flowing through the Nile. Sobek retreated into the murky waters, not in defeat, but because the sea had finally seen the teeth of the river. From that day forward, the Mediterranean no longer regarded the Nile as an ordinary river, and the Nile began to remember the ocean as a force capable of breaking any delta if sufficiently provoked. Water does not possess a single soul. Some waters seek expansion, others seek preservation. Both can sustain the world, both can also destroy it when their order is challenged. As the salt water withdrew from the black mud and the last crocodiles disappeared beneath the river, the mouth of the Nile continued to turn beneath a darkening sky. The whirlpool lingered like a memory, unwilling to close. For once, the sea and the river had tested one another. The children of the gods would have to step beyond the shadows of their fathers. Heracles and Horus were drawing closer to the moment when they would face a question more difficult than any battle. Is legacy a glory inherited? Or is it the immense shadow that destiny demands one day be surpassed? Before the divine realms could understand the true scale of the fracture spreading between Olympus and Duat, its first aftershocks had already begun to touch those born to inherit ancient debts. When the highest gods fall into suspicion and distrust, they are rarely the first to step into unstable borderlands. Instead, they send their children, their champions, those who have long since learned to carry suffering as a natural part of fate itself. Heracles grew up between the blazing light of Zeus's bloodline and the shadow of trials that seemed to have no end. Half god and half mortal, he carried within himself the meeting point of power and limitation. Danger had followed him since childhood. One feat gave to another, like mountains endlessly rising along the horizon. Every victory carried his name farther across the world, yet each one also deepened the debt he owed to the gods. It often seemed that Heracles' life had never truly belonged to him. It belonged instead to the expectations placed upon his shoulders from the moment he first cried beneath the sky. On the other side of the world, Horus came of age beneath the wings of memory and loss. He bore the image of the falcon of kingship, the living embodiment of the sky, the throne, and the inheritance that had once been stolen from his family. The death of Osiris had left more than an empty space within the order of Egypt. It had planted a living oath within the heart of a son. Whenever Horus lifted his gaze towards the heavens, he saw more than the light of the sun. He saw the responsibility to ensure that order would never again be cast into chaos. A strange resemblance existed between them. Heracles carried the legacy of Zeus, yet paid for it through mortal flesh and endless trials. Horus carried the legacy of Osiris, yet grew up burdened with the duty of vengeance and the restoration of a stolen throne. Both were sons drawn into wars they had never chosen for themselves. The monsters they faced were only the visible surface of a far deeper struggle. A struggle against the blood that flowed through their veins, against the memory of their fathers, against the expectations that the gods called destiny. One gloomy day, a veil of grey settled over the palaces of cloud atop Olympus. The sky carried the color of steel before a storm. Zeus summoned Heracles before his throne. There would be no celebration of victories. No songs of praise echoed through the great hall. This mission pointed southward, toward the regions near the Libyan desert, where strange fractures had begun to appear. Dark vapors crept from beneath the earth. Sounds that did not belong to the familiar world echoed among stone and sand. Heracles accepted the command in silence. That silence did not come from hesitation, it came from habit. He had long grown accustomed to the gods giving orders without asking what he desired. His life had been an unbroken chain of trials, stretching from childhood to his greatest accomplishments. Every new task felt like another test, designed to prove that the blood of Zeus within him deserved to endure. He carried with him the olive wood club that had survived countless dangers at his side. Draped across his shoulders was the hide of the Nemean lion, a living memory of his first great triumph. Alongside it lingered the memory of the Hydra, the many-headed beast that grew back whenever it was cut apart, a reminder that chaos never truly consented to die. Far to the south, within a hall of sunlight, bathed in solemn gold, Ra was also summoning Horus to his side. The mission entrusted to him seemed almost a reflection of Heracles' own. Along the western frontier, twisted spirits and unexplained disturbances had begun to appear. Horus was chosen not merely because of his strength. He was the living symbol of kingship itself. He was the guardian of the balance that Ma'at had preserved through countless generations. Within Horus's mind, every sign of chaos awakened memories of Set's shadow. The memory of Osiris remained present like a wound that had never fully healed. Because of this, news of unrest along the frontier felt like more than a mission. It felt like a warning that order itself was once again being violated. One walked beneath the shadow of Zeus like a sentence that had never ended. The other walked beneath the shadow of Osiris like an oath that had never grown cold. Different roads eventually converged along the rocky desert edge west of the Nile. Red winds spiraled through ruined statues and shattered stone steps belonging to a forgotten temple. Heracles was the first to see the other's figure. Through the haze of drifting dust stood a falcon-headed warrior, motionless as carved stone. Golden eyes reflected the sunlight. Above him, sacred falcons circled silently across the sky. Horus, too, studied the stranger approaching from the distance. Heracles' body was marked with old scars. The lion skin rested across his shoulders. The heavy club in his hand seemed to carry the memory of every monster it had ever struck down. Neither offered a greeting. Heracles saw in Horus the mark of a power guarding the borders of chaos. Horus saw in Heracles the image of an Olympian warrior stepping into the domain protected by Ma'at. Suspicion stood between them like an invisible wall. Those born from loss often learn to act before they learn to listen. In their memories, delay almost always wears the face of tragedy. And within that tense silence, fate began preparing a lesson for both of them, one that no god could teach on their behalf. After Heracles and Horus witnessed a creature bearing the marks of both Typhon and Apophis, the debates between Olympus and Duat continued to revolve around the cause of the widening rift between their worlds. Yet the place that felt the change most deeply was neither the sky nor the earth. It was the realms of the dead. The living may divide themselves into nations, empires, and civilizations, but death remains the final destination through which every journey must pass. For that reason, when the boundaries between the underworlds began to tremble, the deepest foundations of cosmic order trembled with them. Souls began appearing in places where they did not belong. Those lingering near death dreamed of strange symbols that had never existed within their own beliefs. Rivers of the underworld reacted in unsettling ways to spirits beyond their rightful domain. The crisis was no longer a territorial dispute among gods. It had become a crisis concerning the very definition of death itself. The world of the living could raise walls and draw borders. The world of the dead existed only through laws. Once those laws began to overlap, even the gods could no longer be certain what they were protecting. Within the quiet pomegranate gardens that lay under the rule of Hades, Persephone had sensed unusual signs for many days. At times, the waters of the Styx flowed backward, as though resisting their own nature. Cerberus repeatedly turned toward unseen pockets of darkness and growled with mounting unease. Along the edges of the underworld appeared wandering spirits, carrying the unfamiliar scent of lands beside the Nile. Even the flowers surrounding Persephone slowly began to carry the fragrance of damp river silt, instead of the cold earth long associated with the Greek realm of the dead. She was the queen of the underworld, the embodiment of the cycle that joined life and death, the springtime maiden once drawn into darkness and returned again to the light. Yet this time, even darkness could no longer maintain its familiar shape. Without warning, the ground opened beneath her feet. It was not the cold abyss of Tartarus. It was a glowing fissure illuminated by the red cold light of an ancient desert. Before she could call Hades's name, Persephone was pulled into the strange expanse below. It was the first time a deity who governed the Greek underworld had been taken beyond the very realm under her authority. The event felt like a silent declaration that the rift had reached the deepest layer of all underworld laws. Duat unfolded before Persephone as a world entirely unlike her own. Hades was a realm of memory, acceptance, and the continued state of being after death. Duat was a perpetual journey through gates, dark waters, trials, and judgments. A black river reflected stars that did not belong to the Greek heavens. Ra's solar bark moved silently through the darkness. Souls waited patiently for their turn before the scales of Ma'at. The spirits there immediately recognized that Persephone carried the breath of spring, of pomegranates, and of the Greek underworld. Yet she bore none of the marks belonging to Duat's system of judgment. Her heart awaited no weighing. Her name existed within none of its laws. Persephone became something that could not be categorized. Duat reacted to her presence like a living body, encountering something that had never existed within its history. At the same time, from the lands of Egypt, Isis deliberately made her way toward the Styx. She brought no army. She carried no threat. The goddess of magic, healing, loyalty, and resurrection carried only the memory of a love that had once crossed through death itself to reclaim Osiris. Charon appeared beside his silent vessel. Isis placed before him an object of golden bronze engraved with the eye of Horus, a greeting offered from another world. Charon did not accept it, not from hostility, but because the rites of the Styx did not operate through the symbols of another civilization. Isis did not argue. She bowed her head before laws that did not belong to her. In that moment, the waters of the Styx trembled softly and parted on their own, opening a faint silver path through the mist. It was not power that opened that passage. It was respect for the grief and laws of another realm of death. Along the overlapping frontier between the Styx and Duat, near the depths of Tartarus, Hades and Osiris finally stood face to face. Behind Hades drifted countless Greek souls, silent as the ashes of memory. Behind Osiris waited spirits preparing to have their hearts weighed upon the scales of balance. One viewed death as an ending that could not be reversed. The other saw death as a process of transformation and spiritual renewal. No weapons were drawn, no threats were spoken. The presence of two different truths carried a weight greater than any battlefield. Then Anubis stepped toward the edge of the Styx. At once, Cerberus opened all 6 of his eyes, growled fiercely, and retreated a rare half-step. The guardian hound of the underworld sensed the scent of funeral resins, mummified flesh, and rites of soul weighing that had never existed within his world. Behind Anubis, Ammit emerged from the darkness. Her form, shaped from crocodile, lion, and hippopotamus, cast many Greek spirits into silence. Tartarus brought suffering. Ammit represented something even more terrifying. Not punishment, but complete erasure from the order of existence itself. When fear ceased to be pain and became the possibility of vanishing from the memory of the universe, even souls long accustomed to darkness began to feel uneasy. A silent question arose between the 2 realms of the dead. What if a Greek died upon Egyptian soil? What if an Egyptian died beneath the skies of Greece? If both the Styx and Duat opened their gates to the same soul? Who possessed the final authority to judge, no one could answer. Zeus had no answer. Ra had no answer. Neither Hades nor Osiris possessed laws for such a circumstance. The crisis had moved far beyond the reach of divine power. It had touched the deepest foundation of every civilization. What happens after death? And who has the right to define the soul's final journey from opposite sides of the rift? Persephone finally saw Isis. One was springtime drawn down into darkness. The other was love that had passed through death to restore what seemed forever lost. There was no battle, no threat, only a shared understanding that the realms of death had begun opening themselves to one another, and that if it continued, the souls of the future might no longer know where their final path truly belonged. While the 2 goddesses gazed silently across the dissolving boundary of the underworlds, the ancient furnaces of Memphis and Olympus began to burn brighter in the world of the living. The sound of hammers striking metal echoed through the long night like the heartbeat of a waking destiny. For when the realms of death could no longer preserve their borders, the gods of creation would begin preparing for the one thing every great conflict eventually requires: weapons. After the disturbances had spread through Duat, the Styx, and the realms of the dead belonging to both civilizations, while many gods began preparing for the possibility of confrontation through lightning, spears, and the strength of armies, there were still eyes that looked upon the crisis from a different direction. Those who carried weapons searched for enemies. Those who pursued knowledge searched for causes. Yet the gods of the forge listened for something deeper than either of those things, the sound of reality itself slipping away from the shape it was meant to hold. Beneath the volcanic depths of Lemnos, Hephaestus stood within the glow of a blazing forge that had once crafted countless instruments for the gods. It had always moved according to the perfect rhythm of fire, metal, and labor. Yet on that day, the flames burned unevenly. Blocks of Olympian bronze and steel bore faint golden streaks that resembled the color of desert sand. A sword that had only just been completed suddenly cracked and split in two upon the stone anvil, despite never having been used. Around him, the hammers of the Cyclopes echoed through the mountain halls, but the familiar rhythm was gone. Every strike seemed delayed by a single beat, as though the metal itself had begun to forget what it was meant to become. Hephaestus saw no army approaching. He heard no threats from Olympus or Duat. What troubled him far more was the sensation that matter itself was losing its ability to hold its own form. If rivers changing course or skies drifting from their paths were signs of instability, then metal forgetting its shape was a sign that the very structure of reality had been wounded. In Memphis, Ptah sensed the same wound, though from a deeper layer of existence. He stood among ancient temple columns, where thought and matter had long been bound together by sacred laws. There were no hammers, no furnaces, only the faintest vibrations moving through stone. A few statues released quiet sounds, like fractures forming from within. The sacred names once anchored firmly to the forms of things were beginning to grow fragile. To Ptah, the crisis did not lie within bronze or stone. It lay within the bond between idea and form. If names could no longer hold matter in place, then the world itself risked unraveling from the creative order that had shaped it since the beginning. Athena and Thoth quickly understood that the two gods were hearing different layers of the same disturbance. One heard the crack within heated metal, the other heard the crack within the very meaning of matter itself. A meeting was arranged upon a stretch of black stone in the Sinai desert, a place that belonged fully neither to Olympus nor to Heliopolis. It stood at the crossroads between sea and desert, between the ancient roads traveled by merchants, smiths, and those who carried metal across civilizations. Within that workshop, blue fire from Greek furnaces cast its glow across ritual tables covered in ancient symbols. The Cyclopes stood beside enormous anvils. Egyptian craftsmen quietly carved sacred names into metal still glowing with heat. Few words were spoken. True artisans often recognized one another through the rhythm of their labor, rather than through language. Hephaestus placed upon the anvil a piece of Olympian bronze, a metal that carried within it the memory of lightning, mountains, and divine craftsmanship. Ptah brought Nubian gold, a light preserved beneath the earth through countless generations. Athena laid down a fragment of meteorite that had once fallen from a distant sky, while Thoth offered a tear of nut, crystallized from the sorrow the heavens had endured as the rift continued to spread. Those materials were melted together within a single flame. The bronze burned blue, the gold burned red. The meteorite shone white, like a star imprisoned beneath the earth. Greek letters and Egyptian hieroglyphs slowly intertwined across the surface of a new object taking shape. It was not a weapon. It was a seal, a circle representing cycles, limits, and the possibility of returning to order. Its purpose was not to destroy an enemy, but to mend the fracture dividing Duat and Olympus. Yet as the seal neared completion, something happened that none of them had expected. The fire died, not because materials were lacking, not because skill had failed, not because the ritual had gone wrong. Ptah gazed at the faintly glowing seal and slowly understood the reason. The creation itself refused to be completed. It would not accept being forged by powers that had not yet learned to limit themselves. Hephaestus understood at once. Every structure that hopes to endure requires a form of sacrifice. The seal did not need more gold, more fire, or more sacred words. What remained absent was a sincere vow from Zeus and Ra. Zeus would have to acknowledge that his sky was not the only expression of order. Ra would have to acknowledge that his light could not pass through every world without listening to the boundaries of others. Only when both accepted the limits of their own authority would the rift cease to be nourished by pride. In that moment, Athena realized a truth that made even the greatest wars seem small. It was easier to find gold than humility, easier to find a meteorite than a vow, easier to gather the tears of the heavens than to persuade a supreme god to surrender the belief that he stood at the absolute center of all things. The unfinished seal rested upon the black stone like a heart that had not yet learned to beat. The shape of salvation had been forged, yet the will required to complete it remained absent. As the final embers faded, Hephaestus and Ptah understood that the hardest task had never been crafting a tool capable of saving the world. The hardest task was persuading those who held the greatest power to accept the limits of their own power. And somewhere beyond the forges, deeper than any oath, an ancient serpent gaze was slowly darkening, as though chaos itself had sensed the empty space that still remained between the gods. The seal forged together by Hephaestus and Ptah remained unfinished. The metal had been shaped. Protective symbols had been carved into sacred stone and divine bronze. Yet the vow of self-restraint that Zeus and Ra were meant to offer one another had still not come into being. Within that absence, the world continued to find new ways to reveal its fractures. This time, the symbol was no longer the fire of the forge or the echo of hammers striking metal. It took on an older shape, the shape of the serpent. Across the memories of many civilizations, the serpent has always existed as a paradox. It sheds its old skin and becomes a sign of rebirth. It moves close to the earth, where the oldest secrets of the world lie hidden, and so it becomes a symbol of knowledge. It carries venom and the breath of death. It rises upon the crowns of kings as a symbol of power and protection. Yet it also bears curses, wounds, and memories twisted by suffering. When a symbol can both heal and destroy, guard a throne and preserve a curse, the question is no longer whether it belongs to good or evil. What truly matters is what its gaze is protecting. Near Cyrene, where the hot winds of the Libyan desert met the salt-laden breath of the Mediterranean, an ancient temple of Athena, long forgotten by the world, began to awaken in a way no one had expected. White marble columns had been worn away by generations of sand. The statue of Athena still gazed toward the distant sea, as though trying to preserve the final memory of the Greek world upon the frontier. Beneath those ancient stones, a narrow crack had opened. Cold air from Duat seeped through layers of rock, quietly spreading into what had once belonged solely to Olympus. The first signs appeared in silence. A shepherd's statue gradually turned gray, frozen within an unfinished movement. A goat crossing the temple courtyard became stone and shattered at the slightest touch. A temple guard happened to catch his own reflection in an old bronze mirror. From the point where his gaze met the image, his skin began to harden into stone. Athena arrived at sunset. A single glance was enough for her to recognize the nature of the disturbance. It was not the power of Egypt, nor was it some new creature crawling upward from the depths of Tartarus. She recognized something that had traveled alongside the history of Olympus itself, the petrifying power of Medusa. Yet Medusa had not truly returned. No body emerged from the darkness. No Gorgon walked again among the living world. What had awakened was only the gaze, the hiss, and the memory that had remained imprisoned for too long within a head severed from its body. The serpents upon Medusa's head began to stir as though waking from centuries of sleep. Their hissing blended ancient Greek tones with morning echoes drifting from the Egyptian land of the dead. Medusa's eyes opened slowly, like an abyss filled with pain that had never been forgiven. Athena stood before the head in silence. For the first time in a very long while, she did not see Medusa as a trophy mounted upon the aegis. She saw something else, a wound, for Medusa was never merely a monster. She was pain transformed into a symbol by the gods themselves. Duat had not created her rage. Duat had only brushed away the dust of time from a memory that had never truly vanished. Meanwhile, from the south, sacred cobras appeared around the temple grounds. They did not arrive like creatures of chaos. They moved in two perfect lines, like living script written by the Nile itself. From between those rows of serpents emerged Wadjet. The cobra goddess of royal authority walked with the dignity of one who had guarded thrones since the earliest ages. Behind her came Sekhmet, goddess of sacred venom, funerary rites, and protection for souls crossing through death. One guarded the boundary of kingship, the other guarded the boundary between poison and protection. Their presence served as a reminder that, in Egypt, the serpent had never been merely a threat. It was also a sacred vigilance through which order endured. The atmosphere within the temple grew heavy. A young warrior accidentally caught Medusa's reflection upon his shield and turned to stone before his scream could finish. More statues faded into cold shades of gray. Wadjet stepped forward. The cobra hoods rose high. Blue fire reflected across stone that was slowly hardening. Around the temple, Sekhmet's sacred scorpions formed a silent circle of containment. Medusa opened her eyes fully. Two divine forms of the serpent stood facing one another. One embodied curse, injury, punishment, and stillness. The other embodied protection, vigilance, sovereignty, and the flame that guarded the crowns of kings. Neither struck first, for Wadjet recognized that what stood before her was not a creature of chaos. It was the final shape of a wound that had never been understood. Athena slowly raised her shield. She did not look directly at Medusa. Just as Perseus had done in another age, Athena used the shield's surface to observe through reflection. Yet this time, the purpose was not victory. She wished to see what remained inside the monster. Within the mirrored metal, Athena did not see a gorgon. She saw a girl. She saw fear. She saw humiliation. She saw rage imprisoned for too long within the shape of a monster the world had grown accustomed to calling by a terrible name. That moment became a painful awakening. A monster can be defeated, but if the pain that created it is never acknowledged, it will always find a way to return in another form. Athena understood that the rift of Duat had not created a new Medusa. It had only awakened something the gods had turned into a symbol and then forgotten the origin of. Wadjet moved closer to Medusa's head. She coiled herself around it. It was not an act of attack. It was a ceiling, a protection, a boundary. The cobras covered Medusa's serpents as though two different histories were being layered upon the same symbol. One belonged to kingship and guardianship. The other belonged to injury and curse. Sekhmet maintained the circle of scorpions around the temple so that no one would accidentally wander into the reach of the petrifying gaze. Slowly, Medusa's power was contained within Wadjet's protective coils. The spreading petrification ceased. Athena stood motionless for a long time before the sight. She understood that not every serpent represented chaos. Some guarded thrones, some protected souls, and some carried within them the memory of an offense that had never been redeemed. As night descended over Cyrene, Wadjet still held Medusa's head within her protective embrace. Athena departed the temple carrying a shield that continued to reflect a face that was not entirely a monster. Darkness settled over things that had not yet been forgiven. Yet elsewhere, amid the first notes of music rising before a war that had not yet been named, other secrets were preparing to emerge from the shadows. For sometimes truth does not appear upon a battlefield. Sometimes it emerges through wine, music, and the words spoken after reason itself has grown weary. After Medusa's gaze had been placed under a new protection, and the symbols of the serpent had retreated into silence for a time, the atmosphere between Olympus and Heliopolis had not truly softened. Explanations, negotiations, and carefully maintained diplomatic pauses resembled little more than a thin layer of sand spread across fractures that continued to widen beneath the surface. Dionysus saw this more clearly than most. He understood that fear does not disappear simply because no one speaks its name. It merely sinks deeper into the mind, waiting for the proper moment to rise again. So instead of calling another council or delivering another warning, Dionysus proposed a festival. The chosen ground lay between Alexandria and the sea, where the salt-scented winds of the Mediterranean met the heated breath of the Egyptian desert. The shoreline stretched like a gentle border, belonging neither entirely to Olympus nor entirely to Heliopolis. It was the perfect place to discover whether music could accomplish what power had not. When night descended, hundreds of torches were lit along the water's edge. Firelight trembled across golden cups filled with wine brought from the hills of Greece, offered as an invitation to forget suspicion, if only for a little while. Egyptian drums blended with the lingering voice of the lyre. Melodies from Pan's flute drifted through the darkness like the breath of distant forests. Satyrs laughed around circles of fire, carrying with them the untamed spirit of instinct. Maenads spun through dances that made the boundary between reason and emotion feel as fragile as evening mist. At first, the festival possessed an almost peaceful beauty. Warriors who had grown accustomed to seeing one another across spear points now raised their cups beneath the same flames. The gods were no longer separated by battle lines. Music guided every step toward a shared rhythm. For a few brief hours, the world seemed to remember what it felt like to exist before suspicion had taken root. It was then that bastard arrived. She carried neither the fury of war nor the scorching force of the sun. Instead, she entered the celebration like a gentle shadow. Sacred cats moved silently around her feet. Their green gold eyes shone like low stars wandering across the earth. Tiny silver bells chimed with every step, weaving themselves into the pulse of the drums as though they had always belonged to the song of the night. Bastard brought with her the feeling of a home protected from storms, of seasons of birth and renewal, of the simple joys humanity has always struggled to preserve within an uncertain world. Yet beneath that gentleness remained a quiet vigilance. The cats did not hiss. They did not attack. They simply watched. They reminded all who saw them that softness is not weakness, just as joy is never entirely separated from the need to defend it. Dionysus looked upon Bastet and realized that she understood festivals much as he did. A festival is not a place where truth is escaped. It is a place where truth changes its shape and walks among the crowd without making everyone flee. The music continued to rise. The lyre intertwined with the drums. Pan's flute joined songs dedicated to the Nile. Satyrs shared cups with the priestesses and priests of Bastet. Maenads danced beside keepers of Egyptian rites. Sacred cats wandered between warriors like a quiet reminder that life always searches for a path through seasons of conflict. Apollo spoke with the priests of Ra about light, as though two artisans were discussing the care of a single flame. Hermes told mischievous stories that drew laughter from younger gods. Even warriors who followed Ares allowed their vigilance to loosen for a moment. Yet that peace had been built from wine and sustained by music. The deeper things had not vanished. A young Maenad suddenly burst into tears while speaking of rumors that Zeus wished to claim Egypt's son for himself. A warrior devoted to Horus answered loudly that the Greeks had always looked upon Egypt as a land of mummies and beast-headed gods. Pan laughed too loudly while remarking that no one in Olympus would kneel before such forms. One of Bastet's priestesses replied in a voice colder than the night sea, reminding him that at least her gods did not allow desire to become betrayal again and again. The laughter remained, but its tone had changed. Words began touching wounds that had never healed. Things once hidden inside councils now emerged beneath the firelight. Dionysus realized that the festival had never erased the tension. It had simply given the tension a voice. Then a drunken satyr stumbled and crashed into a stone pedestal. The statue of a sacred cat toppled to the ground. An Egyptian warrior immediately drew the curved blade from his belt. At that very instant, every one of Bastet's cats arched its back. Their eyes blazed in the darkness as they stared into the crowd before silently vanishing into the shadows. Bastet did not become angry. She merely looked at the fallen statue with a sorrow deeper than rage, for she understood that the festival had not failed. It had accomplished exactly what it was meant to do. The truth had appeared. Dionysus lowered his gaze to the golden cup in his hand and hurled it against the stone. The sharp ring of metal cut through every melody. The drums stopped. The flute fell silent. A heavy stillness settled across the entire shore. No one could pretend any longer that everything was merely a misunderstanding. The fear of being replaced, diminished, forgotten, or pushed from one's place in the world had finally been spoken aloud. War had not yet appeared upon a battlefield, but it had lived in the hearts of those gathered there long before this night. As the shattered cup lay scattered across the stones and the music faded like a lamp hidden beneath a veil, Bastet quietly called her sacred cats back into the darkness. Dionysus stood watching wine spread across the ground at his feet like blood that had not yet taken shape. The festival night had not prevented war. It had simply shown the world that war had already been there, waiting for a deeper echo to rise from the place where Typhon still slept beneath the burning stone of Etna, where another voice was beginning to awaken in the darkness of primordial chaos. No god truly created chaos. The gods built temples, named the stars, and established laws for rivers, harvests, and the realms of the dead. They raised layers of order strong enough for the world to move according to familiar rhythms. Yet beneath every throne, beneath every sacred oath, chaos remained, like an ocean hidden beneath a thin sheet of ice. It never disappeared. It merely slept. After the festival night of Dionysus and Bastet, words that had remained unspoken for months were finally given voice. Fear no longer existed as rumor or cautious glances. It now had a name, a sound, and a place within the minds of young gods. And in that very moment, the deeper layers of the world began to listen as well. Typhon still lay beneath Etna, just as he had for centuries. The creature who once shook the skies of Olympus had become little more than a memory buried beneath stone, fire, and volcanic ash. Yet that memory had never died. It merely slept beneath the weight of an order forged after Zeus's victory. A moonless night spread across Sicily like a veil of black stone. Etna stood motionless beneath the dark sky, resembling a lamp extinguished long ago. Then the earth began to tremble. It was not an earthquake. No violent cracking split the ground. No stones tumbled from the mountainside. There were only slow, steady pulses deep beneath the earth, like the breathing of some colossal creature resting in the darkness below. Shepherds awake through the night watched their goats flee slopes they had known their entire lives. Seabirds changed direction in the darkness as though an invisible current was pushing them away from the island. Within the mountain's fissures, lava glowed brighter than usual. Veins of crimson light spread through heated stone like ancient blood returning to a forgotten body. Typhon had not awakened. He had only opened his eyes, and the first sound that reached him was not the thunder of Zeus, nor a summons from Olympus. It was an echo carried from Duat. In the darkness of the Egyptian underworld, Apophis continued the struggle that had endured through countless cycles of the sun. Each night, when Ra's solar bark entered the waters of darkness, the serpent of chaos rose once more to prevent the light from completing its journey. It was never a war for a throne, never a war for honor. Apophis desired no subjects, no crown, and no worship. What he represented was far simpler and far more terrifying. The possibility that dawn might never return, the possibility that light might fail, the possibility that the world could be dragged backward into the age before any order had ever been established. Since the rift between worlds had opened, the roar of Apophis no longer remained confined to Duat. It slipped through the dark spaces between layers of reality, moving beneath stone, beneath water, beneath the memories of civilizations. It reached Etna like a black river flowing through the depths of the earth. Apophis was the chaos of night. Typhon was the chaos of fire, storms, and earthquakes. Their forms were different. Their domains were different. The symbolic languages humanity used to describe them were different. Yet chaos has no need to learn another chaos by name. Names belong to civilizations. Chaos recognizes itself through a nature that exists before language. Typhon had once been the greatest terror of Olympus. His enormous body was covered in serpent heads and dragon heads. Storms traveled with his breath. Earthquakes followed his movements. His existence itself raised a single terrifying question. Was Zeus truly capable of holding the sky? Apophis posed a similar question to Ra. Not who would rule the world, but whether the world possessed enough order to survive at all. One was imprisoned beneath a volcano. One swam through the dark waters of Duat. One stood against the Greek heavens. One stood against the Egyptian sun. Yet both remained ancient wounds that neither civilization ever forgot. They existed as reminders that all divine power is merely a fragile pause between endless waves of chaos. The fractures linking Duat and Etna began to change. They were no longer a single break. They became hidden currents connecting the darkness of the night sun to the fire beneath the earth, joining sea and volcano, joining the memories of two worlds that had once believed themselves separate. Across Sicily, lava flowed into strange patterns, resembling symbols that belonged to no known alphabet. Within the dark waters of Duat, reflections appeared showing the columns of Olympus cracking apart. Near Etna, several statues of Zeus shed streams of fine stone dust from their hollow eyes. Small temples upon the mountainside developed delicate fractures, yet remained standing, as though the world itself was struggling to maintain its balance against a sickness spreading through its body. Typhon stirred. Each movement sent vibrations across the Mediterranean. It was not the rhythm of the sea, not the rhythm of the Nile, not the rhythm of the sky. It belonged to something older than all of them, deep within caves near Argos. Echidna opened her eyes. The half-woman, half-serpent creature felt a familiar movement, like a heart that had remained silent for too long, beginning to beat again. In the mountains of Lycia, Chimera lifted its head and released a long roar into the night. Beneath the waters of Lerna, where Hydra had long since become memory, strange whirlpools appeared and vanished. Even Cerberus at the gates of Hades turned all three heads toward the same distant direction and howled, sending a tremor through the realm of the dead. None of them were awakening for war. They reacted as nerves react to the movement of the source from which they were born. Far to the south, similar signs appeared. The serpent creatures of Duat emerged from dark crevices near funerary temples. Several sphinx statues along the desert opened their eyes during the night before closing them again at dawn. Swarms of scorpions gathered in circles around cracks in the earth, as though listening to a heartbeat beneath the sand. The priests began to understand that this was no longer a diplomatic crisis. Misunderstanding does not awaken monsters. Misunderstanding does not make stone statues open their eyes. Misunderstanding does not cause Duat and Etna to tremble together. Within the libraries of Sais, Athena and Thoth assembled every piece of knowledge they had gathered. The first rift in the Aegean Sea, the altered pathways within Duat, the gates of the dead standing open, the seal that required the oath of Zeus and Ra, the fears revealed during the festival, the monsters beginning to stir. Slowly, the final image emerged. Typhon and Apophis did not need to meet. Chaos requires no alliance. It requires no treaty. It only needs order to create fractures through its own pride. Every doubt between Zeus and Ra, every conflict between sea and river, every gate of death left open, every insult spoken beneath the festival fires, all of them had become invitations. Athena saw what many gods had yet to understand. Chaos does not triumph when it becomes stronger than order. Chaos triumphs when orders forget that they need one another in order to endure. That night, the climax finally arrived. Etna erupted. A pillar of red fire rose into the darkness like a support of heaven bent out of shape. Lava poured down the mountainside. Within the flames, immense serpent forms moved beneath the molten stone, like veins within a newly awakened body. Typhon rose, only partly, yet it was enough. His roar crossed the sea and echoed all the way to the lands of the Nile. At that same moment within Duat, Apophis lifted his head from the dark waters. The river surrounding the solar bark grew strangely heavy. The gods accompanying Ra understood that this night was unlike any before it. The two embodiments of chaos had still not seen one another, yet the entire world felt them awakening to the same rhythm. Before such movements, the conflict between Olympus and Heliopolis suddenly seemed small. If the gods continued feeding their suspicions and pride, they would unknowingly nourish the very thing rising beneath every throne. As Etna hurled fire into the moonless sky and Duat trembled beneath the body of Apophis, the world seemed to hear two ancient heartbeats pulsing beneath every temple, every river, and every sky. Yet in Pharos, where sea, desert, and light were drawing toward their fateful meeting, the gods continued moving toward war, unaware that what waited beyond every clash was not the enemy of one civilization or another. It was the primordial memory of chaos itself, searching for a path back into the world. No one remembered who threw the first spear. When Typhon stirred beneath the depths of Etna and Apophis raised its head within the deepest darkness of Duat, both Olympus and Heliopolis felt the same unsettling truth: chaos was growing. Yet that shared realization did not bring them closer together. It only sharpened the suspicion that had long smoldered beneath the surface. Each side looked toward the other, as though staring directly at the source of disaster. For generations, Greek storytellers insisted that the creatures of Duat had crossed the sea first, that Egypt had failed to preserve the balance of its own world. Along the Nile, however, the keepers of memory preserved a different image entirely. They remembered the first bolt of lightning striking the sky that belonged to Ra, tearing open a wound between two worlds. As time passed, the cause sank deeper and deeper, like a shipwreck disappearing beneath the sea. What remained were memories of injury. Each side clung to its suffering as proof that it had once been the victim. Wars often begin with a question, but they are remembered through scars. Pharos Island, standing off the coast of Alexandria, became the destined ground of that collision. Once it had served as a beacon for ships wandering across the Mediterranean, resting at the meeting point of blue seas, golden deserts, and the trade routes that connected two civilizations. By day, sunlight washed over its pale stone in a blaze as bright as heated metal. By night, waves crashed against its shores with a sound that echoed like the voices of empires long vanished. The place built to guide the lost became the place where gods themselves lost their way. The sky above Pharos darkened. To the west, Zeus appeared among spiraling masses of black storm clouds. Sacred eagles circled through towering columns of wind, while thunder gathered in such density that it seemed an ocean of living electricity hung suspended above the world. To the east, Ra arrived upon his solar bark. Brilliant crimson discs revolved around him like newborn suns emerging from a single primordial fire. The air trembled beneath such heat that the horizon itself appeared warped and unstable. Between them, the heavens split into streaks of blue and red light, Storm clouds from the west collided with radiance from the east, creating a realm of turmoil that had never existed before. Sailors fell to their knees in terror. Desert birds changed direction in mid-flight. Fish rose to the surface of the sea, their bodies motionless. Then Zeus raised his hand. The first lightning bolt descended like a river of light. Ra answered with a blazing solar disk. The instant those powers collided, seawater erupted into towering columns of white vapor. Sand along the island melted and hardened into sheets of black glass. Stone fractured with sharp, brittle cracks like ancient bones snapping beneath impossible pressure. The world below became the first thing forced to pay the price for the collapse of dialogue. Across the sea, Poseidon drew the full strength of the ocean into battle. Waves rose like vast fortress walls. Triton stood upon the back of a sea steed, sounding his horn until the waters trembled for miles. From the deepest trenches, ancient creatures emerged with the rising tide. From the mouth of the Nile came Sobek. Fresh water surged against the sea. Black silt from floods, long forgotten, rolled through the current like the living memory of Egyptian soil itself. Taveret appeared amid the chaos, her immense sacred hippopotamus form charging into the crashing waters to shield the fertile lands beyond. Sharks from the sea circled through the freshwater currents. Sobek's crocodiles tore into creatures of the deep. River and ocean collided through more than water. They collided through two ancient philosophies. One sought to expand outward and consume everything before it. The other sought to preserve, nourish, and sustain life. Meanwhile, Set stepped forth from the desert. A sandstorm descended across the battlefield like a colossal curtain. Light grew dim. Direction vanished. Set carried with him the chaos of lands that could never be fully tamed. Ares charged directly into that storm. He sought neither reconciliation nor restraint. He moved as though he were war itself made flesh. Athena appeared to stop him. When the aegis met the spear of the war god, the head of Medusa flashed from the shield amid the crimson sands. One believed that war must be controlled to protect civilization. The other believed that war was the unavoidable nature of every civilization ever born. Far above, Horus spread his falcon wings across the sky. His golden spear reflected the burning sun overhead. Apollo drew back his bow of light and released arrows of sunlight through the heavens. This was not a struggle between light and darkness. It was light against light. Each side believed it carried the rightful path for guiding the world. That conviction made the sky blaze so brightly that no one could clearly see what was truly unfolding. Amid the turmoil, the rift linking Duat and Tartarus widened further. Monstrous forms poured through, serpents from the darkness, many-headed creatures bearing the marks of Hydra, twisted sphinxes warped by fire and stone until they no longer resembled anything that had once belonged to either world. Sekhmet hurled herself against them, her claws burning with the brilliance of the sun. Artemis sent silver arrows through the eyes of monsters. They fought side by side, yet an invisible distance remained between them. Artemis distrusted the immense destructive force that Sekhmet wielded. Sekhmet saw hesitation in the way Artemis confronted chaos. Even allies standing on the same battlefield did not truly share the same understanding of justice. Amid the roaring, the crashing waves, and the thunder, Anubis walked across the battlefield. He did not fight. He simply watched. Souls separated from their bodies and drifted through sand, sea, and smoke. Yet for the first time, death itself seemed lost. Greek souls no longer knew whether they should seek Hades or Duat. Egyptian souls could no longer recognize the path that led toward judgment. They wandered, unguided, unnamed, unjudged. War was no longer breaking the borders of nations. It had begun breaking the borders of death. Through the haze of smoke, Hera saw Isis. No words were exchanged. No miracles were invoked. There was only a moment of recognition. Hera, who had always struggled to preserve stability within Olympus. Isis, who had once walked through darkness to restore what had been shattered. Both recognized the same truth. The world was slipping beyond the control of the gods. This war no longer belonged to honor or territory. It was feeding something far deeper. Night descended upon Pharos. Neither side achieved victory. Neither side succeeded in protecting its vision of order. The sky grew heavier. The sea grew darker. The earth trembled longer than before. Prayers rising from both shores began losing their way among the heavens. For the first time, the blood of Greek gods stained the stones of Pharos. For the first time, the blood of Egyptian gods soaked into that same ground, far beneath everything visible to mortal eyes. The rift continued to widen. It cared nothing for victory or defeat. Chaos did not need to destroy the gods. It only needed the gods to weaken themselves. It was during that night that Typhon and Apophis began drawing strength not from their own power, but from the war of those who had once believed they were born to safeguard the order of the world. As divine blood lingered upon the stones of Pharos and lost souls still wandered between Duat and Hades, the world felt for the first time that war no longer belonged only to the gods. Within the shadows that lay beyond thunder and the roar of the sea, smaller emotions endured, yet they proved more persistent than power itself. In the lands of mourning, where souls hadn't yet found their way home, a new whisper was beginning to take shape between Eros and Memphis. The sands near Pharos still carried the grey color of ash. Broken spear shafts lay scattered among shattered stone. Statues of gods that had once stood proudly now leaned in ruin beneath a veil of smoke drifting across the sea. The war was not over. No treaty had been signed. No true reconciliation had been accepted. Yet after days stained with divine blood, both Olympus and Heliopolis had begun to recognize an uncomfortable truth. Even gods could grow weary. Smoke from the battlefield stretched across the water like a dark mist unwilling to fade. Many souls still wandered between realms, neither guided home by Anubis, nor descending into the rivers governed by Hades. Within that landscape of uncertainty, what remained was no longer the desire for victory. It was something far smaller and far more fragile. The desire to be seen, to be remembered, to know that one's existence had not been completely swept away from the world. Eros moved across the skies above Pharos, like a faint spark of light surviving amid heavy clouds of smoke. For ages he had understood love as a mysterious force that drew souls toward one another. Yet now, as he looked upon the exhausted faces of gods on both sides of the conflict, he realized that beneath their anger lived something deeper than pride. The Greek gods feared being forgotten by a new order that seemed to be emerging. The Egyptian gods feared that Mahat itself would be crushed beneath the growing weight of chaos. Beneath every struggle for power lay a more ancient fear, the fear of losing one's place within the memory of the world. It was then that Serket appeared. She emerged silently upon a ruined stone wall overlooking the sea. The goddess of scorpions and protector of the dead carried no visible hatred. Her arrow flew with the speed of a shadowed flash and buried itself deep within Eros's shoulder. It was not meant to kill him. It was meant to prevent love from stirring emotions already made fragile by war. The venom spread like cold fire. Eros saw vows once spoken beneath the stars dissolving into smoke and ruin. He saw mortals falling with no one left alive to remember their names. He saw farewells buried beneath heroic songs that celebrated only the victors. Each vision became another wound. His wings lost their strength. He fell behind a funerary house near the edge of Duat, where walls covered in ancient inscriptions guided souls towards the world beyond. Dim oil lamps illuminated rolls of linen. The scent of sacred resin lingered quietly in the air. There, Nephthys found him. She did not arrive as a goddess of beauty or triumph. She belonged to the quietest part of mourning, the part that remained after the loudest cries of grief had faded away. If there were powers that fought to pull life back from death, Nephthys was the power that ensured suffering would not be abandoned. She carried Eros into a cold chamber with gestures so gentle they were almost invisible. There were no dazzling miracles, no overwhelming displays of divine authority, only silent care offered to a soul trembling beneath the weight of what it had witnessed. Beyond the doorway, the figure of Anubis briefly passed through the corridor, as though he himself were part of the ancient ritual surrounding that place. The venom still prevented Eros from standing. The memories continued to fracture inside his mind. At last, a fear he had never dared name emerged clearly before him. Not the fear of death, not the fear of failure, the fear of being forgotten. He looked toward Nephthys and asked softly, "Do your people fear being forgotten?" Silence lingered beneath the pale golden glow of the lamps. Nephthys understood what it meant to stand beside stories greater than oneself. She understood what it meant to become the shadow behind more famous tragedies, behind names spoken more often than her own. When she finally answered, her voice was as soft as breath. Every god fears that. In that moment, a quiet truth revealed itself. The fear of being forgotten ran deeper than the divide between Olympus and Duat, deeper than arguments about order and chaos, deeper than war itself. Love no longer appeared as possession. It became an act of witnessing, the willingness to remain beside a soul and affirm that its existence still mattered. Nephthys used a strip of linen to wipe the blood from Eros's shoulder. There was none of Aphrodite's radiant beauty, none of Dionysus's intoxicating ecstasy, no festivals, no songs of victory, only a cold room, a wounded god, and a goddess accustomed to staying beside those whom the world no longer remembered. For the first time since the war had begun, Eros closed his eyes. Nephthys could not heal the entire world. She could not mend every fracture dividing the gods. But she prevented one wounded soul from transforming its pain into hatred. Outside the chamber, Anubis watched quietly before turning away, he understood something many gods of war had never learned. A soul that is truly seen within its own fear is far less likely to become a monster. Eros survived the venom. Nephthys came to understand that the Greek gods carried uncertainties much like those of the Egyptian gods. A small connection was formed, not through treaties, not through power, but through care. As Eros drifted into sleep beneath the quiet presence of Nephthys, the small funerary house at the edge of Duat preserved a truth the battlefield could never comprehend. Sometimes, the world is not saved by the greatest display of strength. Sometimes, it is saved by a very small moment in which a soul is not abandoned. From that humble truth, Athena and Thoth would eventually guide Zeus and Ra toward the oldest scales in Egypt, where power itself would, for the first time, be required to stand in judgment of its own nature. After the battle at Pharos, silence carried no victory. It carried only deeper fractures. Olympus had not found the answers Zeus had hoped for. Heliopolis had found no proof to confirm all of Ra's suspicions. Instead, the world seemed to grow more fragile each time the gods called upon their power in an attempt to protect it. Every bolt of lightning hurled from Zeus's hand deepened the tremors beneath Etna, where Typhon still shifted within the furnace of buried stone. Every time Ra widened the solar disk to drive back the darkness, the shadow of Apophis stretched a little farther through Duat, like black ink spreading across still water. Between Hades and Duat, lost souls continued to wander. Some no longer knew to which shore of the dead they belonged. Upon the earth, human prayers drifted uncertainly from temple to temple, like lamps unable to find their direction. The most frightening thing was no longer emerging from Typhon or Apophis. It was emerging from the gods themselves. Both Zeus and Ra had begun to glimpse a truth they had never wished to name. Chaos did not grow only from darkness. It also fed upon the pride of powers that believed themselves to be the sole center of order. When war ceased to mend the fractures and began instead to pull them wider apart, power itself was forced to face its most difficult question. Could it accept limits before the world collapsed beneath its weight? Athena was the first to speak. She did not propose another military campaign, nor did she seek a treaty destined to dissolve beneath suspicion. What she offered was something far more difficult. She demanded that power stand before judgment. Thoth agreed almost at once. Throughout the long months of watching the divide between the two worlds widen, he had come to understand that words, knowledge, and every sacred record meant nothing if no one was willing to let truth be spoken aloud. The place chosen lay deep within Duat. It was the great hall of the scales of Ma'at. For ages beyond memory, souls had been weighed there against the feather of truth to determine whether they had lived in harmony with the order of existence. This time, no mortal soul would approach the scales. There would be no human heart, no sins of the living. The scales would measure something rarer than any of those things. They would weigh the oath of living gods. For the first time since the crisis had begun, Zeus and Ra would not stand as ultimate authorities. They would step before a standard greater than the sky, greater than the sun, greater than the thrones they occupied. The hall of judgment rested beneath the deep blue-black glow that belonged only to Duat. Ancient pillars rose into the darkness overhead. Osiris sat in the distance, the embodiment of impartial judgment, Hades stood nearby, like a depthless shadow no eye could fully measure. Hera waited beside the columns. Isis remained silent within the light. At the foot of the scales, Amit watched with open eyes, yet remained motionless. Zeus entered from the darkness. Ra entered from the light. One carried thunder within him, the other carried dawn. Between them rested only the feather of Ma'at. It was lighter than every sword, every trident, every crown ever forged. Yet in that moment, it weighed more than any throne that had ever existed. Athena stepped forward. There was no rebellion in her voice, no challenge from a daughter against her father. It held the calm certainty of wisdom, compelling power to see its own boundaries. She reminded Zeus of the victories that had built Olympus. She spoke of the Titanomachy. She recalled the day Typhon was buried beneath Etna. She remembered the city-states that had once looked to the heavens and begged for protection. Then Athena asked whether those victories meant Olympus must therefore be right in every age that followed. Zeus did not answer immediately. His gaze settled upon the scales. Within the memory of the king of gods stretched countless centuries spent preserving order. He had always believed that if Olympus weakened, chaos would prevail. He had believed that strength must constantly expand in order to keep the world standing. For the first time, that belief stood before him like a mirror. Zeus had not been defeated by Ra. He had been forced to confront himself. At last, the god of thunder spoke. He admitted that he had always believed a weaker Olympus meant a stronger chaos. Yet because of that belief, Olympus had never learned the discipline of self-restraint. Silence spread through the hall. Not long afterward, Thoth stepped before Ra. He asked only one question. If only your light is truth, then why does darkness still return every night? The question reached the very root of the sun's journey. Ra remembered countless nights crossing Duat. He remembered confronting Apophis upon the river of shadows. He remembered endless battles in which dawn had to be earned again and again through effort and endurance. Then he realized something. Darkness had never vanished. It had only been passed through. He had fought as though one day light might erase darkness forever. Yet chaos does not disappear when it is denied. It grows whenever light begins to see itself as absolute. Ra lifted his head. His voice echoed slowly through the hall. My light is not the only sun. The moment those words were spoken, the hall trembled softly. Not from anger, not from power, but from a truth delayed for far too long, finally finding a shape in language. The scales of Ma'at began to glow. They did not weigh divine blood. They did not weigh victories. They did not weigh temples or territories. They weighed honesty. They weighed the ability to accept limits. They weighed the courage to admit that even power itself could be judged. Amit's golden eyes widened, yet the ancient creature did not move. For the purpose of this weighing was not to destroy Zeus or Ra. It sought only to know whether they would continue feeding chaos through pride. Hera and Isis remained silent. It was the silence of those who understood that certain oaths could never be spoken by another. At that same moment, beneath the black stone layers of Sinai, the seal forged by Hephaestus and Ptah began to tremble. Olympian bronze burned blue once more. Nubian gold rang like the song of sunlight across water. the ancient meteorite opened, revealing symbols that belonged neither to Greece nor to Egypt alone. The inscriptions that had once opposed one another now turned in the same rhythm. Hephaestus understood that material had never been the missing ingredient. Ptah understood as well that every form was meaningless if the idea within it remained filled with pride. The seal blazed with light because its final component had finally appeared. Not metal, not magic, but the self-restraint of power. As the light upon the scales slowly settled, Zeus remained Zeus, Ra remained Ra. Neither bowed before the other. Olympus did not merge with Heliopolis. Both worlds retained their own identities. Yet something had changed. Zeus understood that his sky was not the only way to name order. Ra understood that his sun was not the only light entitled to shine upon the world. Both came to understand that even thrones could be wrong. For order does not survive because one power becomes strong enough to dominate everything else. Order survives when powers know where to stop, allowing other things to exist beside them. In the deepest reaches of chaos, Typhon and Apophis sensed a new threat, not thunder, not sunlight, but humility. Duat began to tremble from its deepest foundations. The scales of Ma'at fell silent. The seal within Sinai shone like a moon forged from oaths. Zeus and Ra still stood separated by the full history of two mythologies. Yet that distance no longer resembled an open wound. And at the very moment chaos realized the gods had stopped nourishing it with pride, a vibration rose from the depths of Duat like an ancient summons. The final night had arrived. It would be the night when thunder did not replace the sun. Thunder would escort the sun through the darkness. The final night began with a silence more frightening than any thunderclap or prophecy. After Zeus and Ra had stood before the scales of Ma'at, acknowledged their own limitations, and witnessed the Hephaestus Ptah seal ignite between the two worlds, many of the gods had hoped that order was finally beginning to heal itself. Yet when the hour of dawn should have arrived, the sun did not appear. To the east of Egypt stretched nothing but an endless band of grey ash. Priests stood upon cold stone steps, gazing toward the place where light was born each morning. Yet no trace of the solar bark could be seen. Across the Aegean, the sea lay dark as cooled metal. The columns of Apollo's temples stood motionless within the dimness, no longer reflecting the familiar first rays of day. Both Greece and Egypt felt the same Thoth. If Ra failed to cross Duat, dawn would not return. And if dawn did not return, all the differences that had once made civilizations proud would suddenly seem small before the same darkness. In the deepest layer of Duat, where memory and nightmare could no longer be clearly separated, Typhon and Apophis had found one another. They did not merge in flesh. The shadow of the great serpent coiled around Typhon's rage the way night coils around a sleeping volcano. Storms, molten fire, colossal serpents, darkness, and the denial of light twisted together into a being that no longer belonged to any single mythology. It was no longer the enemy of Zeus, nor the enemy of Ra. It had become a fracture within order itself. Chaos no longer needed the gods to distrust one another in order to survive. It had grown large enough to stand directly across the path of dawn. Ra stood aboard the solar bark upon an endless sea of black water. For the first time in cycles older than human memory, he did not travel through Duat alone. Beside him stood Zeus. The god of the sky and thunder had not come to rule the underworld, nor to prove that Olympus stood above the sun. He simply stood there, silent as a marker stone amid a storm. Their oath of self-restraint had not made them friends. It had only made them wise enough to understand that this night held no room for a struggle over light. The world did not need a god who won absolutely. The world needed powers mature enough to walk into darkness together without turning one another into enemies. The solar bark drifted deeper into Duat. The realm of the dead seemed warped that night, like a mirror bent beyond recognition. Funeral pillars leaned at impossible angles. Pathways into the underworld opened and closed by themselves. Greek and Egyptian souls wandered through dissolving boundaries. Some carried the appearance of Hades upon them while bearing funerary symbols from the lands along the Nile. Hermes and Anubis moved together through that darkness. One opened paths through labyrinths of fractured memory. The other ensured that souls did not forget their own names. Their voices echoed through the deep night. Each name spoken aloud became a thread, pulling a soul back from the edge of oblivion. In every civilization, the loss of one's name had always been a death deeper than death itself. As the two guides worked side by side, the underworld slowly began to reveal roads instead of fractures. Above Duat, the sky trembled as though it were about to shatter. Apollo gathered what remained of Greece's light into fragile strands that held the collapsing heavens together. Horus spread his falcon wings around the solar bark. One eye searched the darkness where Apophis hid. The other maintained the rhythm of the sky itself. Two lights that had once regarded each other with suspicion now overlapped like twin dawns protecting a single vault of heaven. Light no longer fought against light. Light had learned how to support light. From the black waters below, monsters rose without end. Hydras woven from shadow and countless heads. Distorted sphinxes that looked like torn memories given form. Creatures with lion heads, serpent bodies, and bat-like wings trembling in the depths of night. They seemed like errors left behind from the first moments of creation. Heracles and Sekhmet stood side by side along the edge of the vessel. The heroes' club crushed the bodies of monsters climbing toward the deck. The solar fire burning within the war goddess's eyes reduced every fragment of chaos to ash the moment it touched the light. They were no longer fighting for Zeus or for Ra. They fought because they understood that if this night failed, no civilization would survive long enough to remember their names. At the center of Duat, Athena and Thoth stood before the slowly turning seal, suspended within the darkness. They understood that not everything could be slain with weapons. Some things had to be called by their true names before they could be healed. Ancient symbols revolved around them. Greek letters, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the markings of the Hephaestus Ptah seal. Athena and Thoth spoke the true name of the fracture. It was pride. It was the fear of being replaced. It was the belief that only one light, one sky, one realm of the dead had the right to exist. As those names were spoken, the seal expanded like a metal sun blooming within the heart of Duat. For the wound in the world had never been merely a physical crack. It had always been an idea twisted out of shape. And so it required wisdom, oaths, and self-restraint to be healed. The entirety of Duat trembled. Typhon Apophis revealed itself. At times, it appeared as a colossal serpent devouring stars. At times, it wore the body of Typhon, with hundreds of serpent arms reaching from the darkness. At times, it was simply a blackness that could see. The Styx and the Nile rose together in towering waves. Ancient pillars collapsed. Souls were dragged toward oblivion. Even the gods felt the primal fear that humanity had once known before the first storm of the world. Zeus stepped to the bow of the vessel. Ra stood behind him, keeping the solar flame alive within the depths of night. The first bolt of lightning tore through the darkness, but this time, lightning did not strike to dominate the sun. Lightning struck to clear a path for the sun to continue. In that moment, thunder and sunlight no longer competed for their place in the heavens. One power protected the path of another. Zeus hurled the greatest lightning bolt he had ever summoned through the shadow of Typhon. Ra drove the solar bark into the opening of light that followed. Apophis coiled around the vessel, attempting to drag dawn into the waters of night. Horus and Apollo pulled light downward like two overlapping wings of the sun. Sekhmet tore apart the serpent heads, climbing onto the deck. Heracles drove his club into the body of chaos, struggling to rise from the abyss. Hermes guided souls away from collapsing regions. Anubis called the names of spirits on the verge of fading into oblivion. Athena and Thoth activated the seal. Metal from Olympus glowed blue. Gold from the southern lands burned red. The symbols of two mythologies turned within the same rhythm. The fracture began to close, not quickly, not easily, but for the first time. The gods were no longer fighting chaos while simultaneously feeding it through their own divisions. They did not prevail because each of them was stronger alone. They prevailed because they stopped turning difference into a wound. Typhon Apophis was driven back into the deepest darkness beneath Duat. It did not die. Chaos had never truly died. It merely returned to sleep beneath the order that had been stitched together once more. For pride, fear, and the desire to make one truth absolute would always remain, and they could awaken the darkness again whenever worlds forgot the lesson of this night. The solar bark continued its journey. Far ahead, the first thread of light appeared. The sun returned above the Nile before its rays reached the Aegean Sea. Temple doors opened, seabirds returned to the sky. People knelt in emotional silence, as though the world had just been created one more time. Olympus did not become Egypt. Egypt did not become Greece. The gods retained their own memories. The worlds retained their own boundaries. Yet those boundaries no longer resembled wounds that were destined to bleed. They became doors. Doors that could remain open only through humility. Long afterward, when the sun rose above the sea and the first rays touched the horizon, people would sometimes hear distant thunder rolling behind the light. Not because Zeus sought to claim the sky of Ra. It was merely the lingering echo of the final night in Duat, when thunder learned how to escort the sun, and when dawn crossed the Nile before reaching the Aegean. The world did not become simpler. It merely became peaceful enough to endure. Perhaps that was the closest thing to peace the gods had ever touched. Not a world without differences, but a world where differences no longer had to become war each time they were seen.